So, I want to welcome you tonight. I'm Susan Grant, the library director. And tonight we have, I forgot to ask you how to say your name.
Szczesny. I usually tell people just give it a try.
Well, I was going to say something different. So Dan Szczesny is here, and I bet you get tired of that.
Well, you should see, I have to teach it to my daughter now, so that's going to be a lot of work.
So I want to give you a little background info because I know he's not going to toot his own horn about how good he is. But let's start with his career. He began his career in Buffalo, New York. Since then, he has written for a wide variety of regional and national publications, including the Maine Times, Philadelphia Weekly, Christian Science Monitor, Princeton Packet, which I've never heard of, Pennsylvania Magazine, Appalachia Journal, AMC Outdoors, Yahoo Parenting, and Huffington Post. So he's got a lot of stuff on his plate. In 2000, he moved to New Hampshire from where?
I was in New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay. To cover the presidential election. And in 2001, he became associate publisher of the Hippo, now the state's largest arts and entertainment journal, which I did not know. He's a member of the Appalachian Mountain Club's 4,000 Footer Club and has written extensively about the outdoors and hiking. He's been here before too, so you probably aware of the other programs. His books include the Nepal Chronicles, about a month-long trek to Everest Base Camp, and Your Marriage in Kathmandu. Yes. That must have been fun.
It was very fun.
And won the 2016 New Hampshire State Library Award for Outstanding Work of Nonfiction. He's the editor of Murder, Inc., a series of New England-based pulp fiction anthologies set in or around the newsroom. That sounds good too. His short story, White Like Marble, was a finalist in the 2017 Ernest Hemingway Foundation Short Shorts Contest out of the Hemingway birthplace in Oak Park, Illinois. So you are global, aren't you?
I guess so.
Okay, so this is his latest project, the White Mountain. He spent a year exploring the very heart of the White Mountains. And we had a program last month about Mount Washington, home of the world's worst weather. And we know it's more than just a rock pile. It's the cultural and natural soul of climbers and tourists from around the world. Mount Washington speaks to the adventurer in all of us. Some of us don't have that. We just watch others. And Dan turns his veteran journalist's eye toward capturing it all in his new book, The White Mountain, which he's going to share with us tonight. So let's give.
What's your name?
Troy.
Troy. Do I move around a lot? Are you going to move with me, or are you just
I'll move with
you? Don't care what I do? Okay. Okay. He's a professional. He'll follow me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming very much. I'm really pleased to hear that Will from Mount Washington Observatory was here last month. So this is a good supplement. Did some of you see that show last month? Yeah. He's a great guy. He puts on a great program. It's an amazing place up there, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Over the course of 1 year, well, actually, quick show of hands first. How many of you have been to the top of Mount Washington? Just two. A long time ago, maybe? Yeah. I have been doing programs now. I'm going to put this down. I've been doing programs now for this book, coming up on, oh my goodness, June, July, August, September, October, November. We're 6 months into this tour. All 6 New England states, plus New York, plus New Jersey, plus Pennsylvania, and I always ask that question. It's the first question I always ask. And it's remarkable the amount of people who have been to the top of the mountain. We're talking 90-95% of the folks that I speak to have been in one way or the other to the top of that mountain, and that speaks volumes to its the long shadow that this mountain casts. Not only over just New England, but over the rest of the United States, and in fact over the rest of the world. Some of that has to do with accessibility. I'm sure we'll talk to you quite a bit about the volume of people who in any given season go up to the top of the mountain. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So years ago, probably this is 4 years ago now, I was sitting in my publisher's kitchen. My publisher who published the Nepal Chronicles and my collection of short stories with me, and we were going over story ideas. It was a pitch session, basically. And he asked me what I had, and I went over 5 or 6 ideas with him at length. I had prepared for this session. I had some book ideas things that I wanted to write. And after about 20 minutes or so of this, his eyes began to sort of glaze over. And I could tell I was losing him. And he leaned back and he said, what else do you have? And there was a story that I had kicking around in the back of my brain since I first moved up here to New Hampshire all the way back in 1998. From the first time, I came from Buffalo, New York, Western New York. I came from New Jersey, from Philadelphia. There's not a lot of mountains in any of those places. So from the very first time that I drove through the White Mountains and began to realize how much happens around Mount Washington, and not just the hikers, but the train buffs and the bicycle buffs and the car buffs and planes and the science and the observers and all that type of stuff that all over the course of a year. I had this idea in the back of my head, but I never had the ability or the time, I think, or the resources to sort of fully realize it until I was sitting in his kitchen that morning, and I was desperate. And he said, what else do you have? And I said, well, how about a year in the life of Mount Washington? And that was it. That was the elevator pitch, a year in the life of Mount Washington. And he leaned back and he said, tell me more about that one. So here we are. From January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017, I either lived on, around, near, or researched, or chased people having to do with Mount Washington. And by chased people, I mean I went to Chicago, Buffalo, State College, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and all places in between, all 6 states, because again, this mountain's shadows is quite long. So I'm an experiential journalist. I very much believe that if I'm going to be writing to you about the Cog Railway, that I should shovel coal on the Cog Railway, which I did. If I'm going to be writing to you about the observatory at the top of the mountain, then I'm going to live at the observatory, which I did for a week in the winter. And if I'm going to be writing to you about the foot race that happens up the Mount Washington Auto Road, then I'm going to run in the foot race on the Mount Washington Auto Road. And I did. So I did this over and over and over again over the course of a year. I touched that summit sign over the course of a year about 80 times during my time up there. So I was up there, once every 4 days or so in one form or another. So what we're going to do today, this is a big topic, and it covers 400 years or so of writing and literature and map making and mythology and legend. We don't have the time to go through all that today. But what I do want to do is give you 4 stories that have to do with the 4, what I call them the legs of the table that is Mount Washington. If you think of Mount Washington as a table with 4 legs, those 4 legs would be the Mount Washington Observatory, the Cog Railway, the Mount Washington Auto Road, and the Appalachian Mountain Club, and the hikers who are members of the Appalachian Mountain Club. So we're going to go over, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and then we're going to go over those 4 legs, and I have little stories attached to each of those. And then at the end, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions and answers, and we can get into more detail at the end if you so desire. Does this give me, whoops, that turns on, there we go. Cool. Okay, so, Mount Washington, 6,288 feet and 2 inches high, officially. It's part of the Appalachian. I'm not going to go over a whole lot, as I'm sure Will went over some of this with you. It's part of the Presidential Range in northern New Hampshire. An approximately 19-mile or so range. Mount Washington is known for 2 things. One is its accessibility. We'll talk a lot about that in a bit. And the other is, of course, its extreme weather. Mount Washington and the Presidential Range sit right at the crux of 3 major weather systems that are constantly butting heads. One comes off the water, one comes down from Canada, one comes up from the Ohio Valley. There has been snow at the top of Mount Washington over its history on every day of the year. It's the high temperature of Mount Washington in its history since 1932, since they've been recording, has only been 72 degrees. So it's a magnet for meteorologists and universities doing glacier or cold weather or weather experimentation, and that's what brings the people. Here's a shot of myself. I'm looking west here at a sunset, and there's a shot of a sunrise looking east from the Weather Observatory platform. Darby Field was the first European to climb Mount Washington in 1642. Darby himself was illiterate. He didn't do any writing that we know of. The only reason that we know that he did climb is because of the governor at the time helped fund his expedition in the summer of 1642, and he's the one who wrote about it, Governor Bennington. Now, why did Darby Field go up there? Well, in the mid-17th century, you could see the White Mountains very clearly from the Portsmouth area. Darby was from the Portsmouth-Dover area. And it was very white and sparkly and bright. And a lot of people thought that there was diamonds and gold and silver and all sorts of other good things at the top of those mountains. Darby was a merchant. He put together an expedition and up he went. That explains why he went the first time. It doesn't explain why he went a second time a couple of months later. But our story is actually going to begin all the way into 1826 with this painting. This is Thomas Cole. Are there any painters or landscape artists or anything like that? Art aficionados in the audience? This is Thomas Cole, born in London, came to New York, lived in New York and Boston for a while before finally settling in Catskill, New York, along the Hudson River. Thomas Cole is what we now call the founder of the Hudson Valley School of Art, or sometimes called the White Mountain School of Art. This particular painting, 1826, came out of a series of trips that Thomas did in the early 1820s, 1823, 1824, and 1825. He actually went up and down. He spent 6 weeks in 1825 up in the White Mountains before coming back with a whole series of pictures, including this one, which is called The View of Mount Washington. Simple enough. Him and his contemporaries, I should say his acolytes, because Albert Birdstead was painting a couple of decades later, were very interested in a couple of things. And you can see some similarities between these two paintings, even though they're about 2 decades apart. Albert's painting here is a 7 by 10 canvas with a 1.5 foot gold frame. It would have taken up this entire wall. And if you were in Boston or New York or Philadelphia, Vienna, Paris, San Francisco, all places where these paintings were exhibited at one time or another, and you walked into a room, this painting was probably alone in that room with a series of seats in front of it. It felt like you could walk into this painting. But this painting and Thomas's, I use these two as examples, there were hundreds of them, but this painting and Thomas's are similar in 2 ways. Number one, if you went to this place then, this is Crawford Notch, north of Crawford Notch, if you went to this location then or now, you would not find this view. This view does not exist. Mount Washington didn't look like that then, it doesn't look like it now. They weren't interested in portraying sort of a realistic landscape. They were interested in the exaggerated landscape. The other thing to remember is that in 1826 and the 1820s, there was no railroad yet into the White Mountains. The roads were terrible. There was only a couple of inns that were open. If you wanted to go up into the White Mountains from Boston, today Boston is a 3 to 10 hour ride, depending on Boston traffic, to get to the White Mountains. But back then, we were talking about 2 or 3 days. You had to rent a carriage. You had to basically bring your own food. Where would you sleep? People were afraid to go into the White Mountains. It was a scary place. So when these paintings started coming back, they were illustrating 2 things. One, a valley that was fertile and calm and beautiful. Those animals look like they would walk right out of the painting. Look at this in Thomas's picture. There's a guy who's actually carrying his lunch through the through the notch there. But in the background, the mountains were almost always terrifying, right? There's always snow up there. There's always a storm brewing up at the top. I think of these guys as sort of the Instagrammers or the YouTubers of the day, right? This painting, if it was on Instagram, would get 100,000 likes and people would all want to go there. These are the very first images that began to drive tourists into the White Mountains. And partially because this is called the Emerald Pool. Doesn't an Emerald Pool look beautiful? I mean, people stopped being so scared of the mountains when they started realizing, oh, we can go and see the mountains, but we don't have to go up into them, right? We can just go and hang out in these valleys. So tourists started coming. This is a shot today, recent, from Mount Monroe, which is just south of Mount Washington. We're about a mile south of Mount Washington right here. These 2 little tarns are called Lakes of the Clouds. Has anyone stayed at any of the AMC huts in the past? Yeah. The AMC has 8 huts up in the White Mountains. They're spread apart, high huts they call them. They're spread apart so that you could, in theory, you could do a 9-day trip, right, from hut to hut to hut each day. Getting a little bit closer to the summit here, there's a Tuckerman Ravine on the right there. And there's a shot from the west of the sunset. And this is a good place for us to start today. On the left here you can see the track of the Cog Railway going up the mountain. So let's begin with the Cog and our first leg of our table. This particular stereoscope is from the Boston Library. The Boston Library has an enormous archival collection of White Mountain stereoscopes and Mount Washington stereoscopes. I like this one in particular, in part because it really kind of seems like the photographer was interested in taking pictures of the rocks, wasn't it? and like those things in the background just happened to be there in the picture. That's the Tip Top House on the right, built in 1851, and that is in the center of the picture. The very first Cog engine called Old Pepper Sass. It started chugging up the mountain in 1869, so this picture is probably early 1870s, maybe 73, 74, somewhere in that area. And here's a closer shot of that same engine. It was called Old Pepper Sass because somebody thought that the boiler looked like an old pepper sauce bottle. It was built by a fellow by the name of Sylvester Marsh. I'm happy, once we get to the question and answer period, to get into the engineering of the Cog Railway. It's really a fascinating story. But for our purposes today, I want to tell you a little bit about this guy. If you go to the Cog Railway, has anyone who's taken the Cog Railway? A couple of people have said, yeah, a couple. If you go to the Cog Railway today, there's a museum at the Cog Railway at Marshfield Station, and the museum goes into a fair amount of detail about how the Cog was built, how in the history of the Cog from 1869 up. There's not a whole lot about Sylvester himself, especially his life prior to the Cog Railway. And that's where I started. I started working my way backwards, in part because one of the first things that I figured out was that Sylvester was nearly 60 years old in 1869 when the Cog first started chugging its way up the mountain. Nearly 60 years old in 19th century New Hampshire before he built his greatest invention. I wanted to know what those first 59 years were like. What led him to that point? And the story is fascinating. He was born in Hampton, New Hampshire, so he's a local boy. He was born on a pig farm. His father was not part of the picture. His mother moved off the farm, took his brother with him when he was very young, leaving Sylvester as a teenager on this farm alone. And he didn't like that at all. So he packed his bags and he walked to Boston, Massachusetts. And the reason that he walked to Boston, Massachusetts is because he heard about this new market that had just opened up a few months earlier where he thought he could get a job. And that market was Quincy Market. And he did get a job. He got a job in the sort of meat packing and produce section of Quincy Market. And he worked there for about a year and a half. But he started hearing stories about this city. It wasn't even a city at the time, about this town on the frontier, the western frontier, on the far west part of the Great Lakes, where somebody with a little bit of gumption and a little bit of bravery, because it was far away from us, could get land for either free or for cheap. So Sylvester packed his bags again for the second time in his life, got on a steam train, and made his way to a little-known village called Chicago, Illinois. When Sylvester showed up in Chicago in the mid-1830s, there was 212 people living in Chicago at the time. He had a backpack full of land stakes. He walked from the Lake Michigan up the Chicago River for about a quarter mile, set those land stakes out, basically just claimed a plot of land that he thought was big enough for him to build his 3.5-story steam-powered meat processing plant, which is what he did. For decades, that plant was one of the largest buildings in the Midwest. The swine and flour and grain were coming in from the Midwest. They would go in one door of Sylvester's meat processing plant, out the back door, to be sold across the Great Lakes, into Buffalo, over the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River to New York and to Boston. So Sylvester started making a lot of money, but he had a problem. And the problem came from Buffalo, New York. I am from Buffalo, New York. This is my hometown. So I was thrilled to actually be able to go home and spend a week researching this book while living with my 2 nephews and my sister, which was actually really cool. I think my nephews probably got a little bit sick and tired of me of wandering around downtown Ward 1, which is where all the mill buildings are in Buffalo, New York. Here's Sylvester's problem. The Erie Canal had just opened about a decade earlier. Buffalo, New York at the time, in the 1840s, was the largest port of call for the grain and flour industry in the world. It had 36 grain mills in Buffalo, New York, more than London, more than Liverpool, more than New York. But the journey over the Erie Canal, the 400-something miles over the Erie Canal, grain suppliers and mill suppliers were losing a lot of money on that journey because they were having a hard time keeping the grain and flour dry for that trip over the Erie Canal. And they would put them on these big, long ore boats. So Sylvester packed his bags, again, 3rd time in his life, and he moved to Buffalo, New York, specifically with the idea that he was going to fix that problem. Now back in Chicago, Sylvester already had 17 or 18 patents. He was already quite wealthy. He could have retired if he wanted, but he knew if he could fix that problem that he would become much, much wealthier. He had already started investing in grain and flour. Here we are in the Erie. This is Lake Erie. Here's the Niagara River. If you look at the middle of your screen here, that's a Reed elevator, one of the largest wooden grain elevators ever built. Next to that Reed elevator, if you look even more closely, you can see the Marsh Choleric grain dryer. Sylvester invented the Marsh Choleric grain dryer. It wasn't a dryer like we know today where we put our clothes in. It was a whole building in and of itself that had to be attached to the side of one of these grain mills. It had a 70 by 100 foot steel pan, articulating steel pan, with tiny pinholes in the pan and air jets that blew up from below. So the grain would be dried in this pan. The giant arm of the mill would pick the dried grain up, plop it right into the boats, and send it across the Erie Canal. By the time, by the late 1840s, when Sylvester retired, he was not even 50 years old. He was one of the top 20 wealthiest men in the country. His Marsh grain dryer, of the 36 mills in Buffalo at the time, 30 of them came equipped with one of Sylvester's grain dryers. So he was going to retire. That was his plan. He was going to go back to New Hampshire. He was going to become a gentleman farmer. He was going to hit the socialite scene, buy himself some fancy clothes, and basically live out a life of being a fancy, aristocratic gentleman, maybe get into politics, who knows. That didn't happen. Actually, let me show you you can see in the actual photo, this is the Reed elevator. That building with the smokestack there, that's Sylvester's grain dryer. So, anybody recognize the fellow in the middle here?
Jack London? Is it Jack London? No.
That's Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh.
Yep. Yeah. This picture is taken at the Tip Top House at the top of Mount Washington in the fall of 1869. What does Ulysses S. Grant have to do with Sylvester Marsh? Well, Sylvester went back to New Hampshire to retire. That never stuck. Sylvester was not the kind of guy to sit around doing nothing. He didn't like parties. He didn't like the socialite scene. He liked to work. And because of that, he got a terrible case of indigestion. A debilitating case of indigestion, in fact. It was stress indigestion. And his doctors told him, Sylvester, go out and get some fresh air. That was the prescription. Sylvester being Sylvester, fresh air to Sylvester meant, I'm going to try to climb Mount Washington. Sylvester was not a climber. He didn't have the clothes for it. He was out of shape. He'd never done it before. But he went and did it anyway. And he almost died doing it. He actually got caught in a storm. He writes in his journals that he crawled on his hands and knees into the Tip Top House near death, he writes, exhausted, dehydrated. Now, any one of us had that happen to us. That might have been a one and done. We're not going to try that again. Not Sylvester. Sylvester's first thought upon recovering from this expedition was there must be an easier way to get up this mountain. So he set about inventing it. And that's when he invented the Cog Railway. Now, like I said, at the end of this, we can go into sort of the details of the cog. But in 1869, The Cog had been up and running for 6 months. It had opened in the spring of 1869, and it was chugging its way up the mountain. But Sylvester once again had a problem to solve, and that problem was no one was coming. And no one wanted to ride the Cog Railway. He was having trouble getting tourists or people or anyone to get on his train and drive up the mountain. There's a couple of reasons for this. We think today of the Cog as sort of a quaint throwback to the industrial age. At the time, however, the Cog Railway was the equivalent of getting onto the top of the Apollo 11 and going into space. He was the Elon Musk of the day, shooting Teslas to Mars. It was the cutting edge of technology, and nobody wanted to be the first casualties of this technology. So remember when Sylvester was back in Chicago, he grabbed a bunch of land along the Chicago River. He was sued way back then, but there was no district court in Chicago for that lawsuit to go anywhere at the time, until 1860. In 1860, that lawsuit, that land case, is called the Sandbar case, went to Chicago District Court. Sylvester was already in New Hampshire working on his Cog Railway, and he had to reach back into Chicago to find the best lawyer that he could in Illinois in 1860. Any idea who he may have come across? Illinois in 1860? Abraham Lincoln. That's right. Abraham Lincoln represented Sylvester Marsh in 1860 in the Sandbar case, and he won that case for him. Flash forward 9 years. Sylvester is having trouble getting people to ride the Cog Railway. Using his connections that he made with Lincoln, with his friendship with Abraham Lincoln, he reaches down to Washington, D.C., managed to contact the very popular at the time sitting president Ulysses S. Grant, and convinces him to come on vacation in northern New Hampshire, which Grant does. Grant reserves an entire Cog Railway car for his staff. There's his wife, Julia, here, and 6 members of his cabinet are in this picture. This is Sylvester here, by the way, this scowling fellow. Yeah. Sylvester rents a second car to follow that car up and packs it with media. They get to the top of the mountain, they take this picture. The media come and ask President Grant what he thought of the ride. Grant says not only is the Cog Railway safe, but it's one of the finest tourist attractions in these here United States. The next morning, Sylvester was scowling no longer. Because the line for the ticket line, the line for tickets wrapped around the ticket window at the base camp, and Sylvester and the Cog Railway was up and running. Sylvester was a problem solver for his entire life. He was a problem solver, not a great hiker, but he was a problem solver. Today, the Cog Railway uses 2 original steam engines and 5 biodiesel engines. This is one of the original steam engines. This is the Wombat. It was built in 1908 in Manchester, New Hampshire. The Amoskeag Locomotive Works built most of those early steam engines for the Cog. And the second one is the Ammonoosuc. The Ammonoosuc was built in 1896. So those 2 steam engines are still powering their way up the mountain. They use biodiesel today. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, and it's faster. And faster means that the Cog Railway can get more runs up and down the mountain, and more runs up and down the mountain mean that they make more money. So they were perfectly happy to go to biodiesel. And there's the Cog Railway tracks in the wintertime. And that leads us to the second leg of our journey, the Washington Observatory. Has anyone been to the observatory? Has anyone stayed overnight at the observatory? No. This shot is from about 1936. So there was an observatory at the top of the mountain in the 1900s, from 1870s through 1891. What we know today is the United States Signal Corps ran a makeshift observatory only in the summer, in the good weather, out of the Tip-Top House. It was cold, the instrumentation was bad, the recording was bad, nobody really wanted to do it, so they abandoned it in 1891. And it wasn't until 1932 that a group of 4 founders, they called themselves the Founders, refounded the observatory and built what they called the Signal House, the Observatory Signal House. 2 of those founders are in this picture. The guy at the top there is a fellow by the name of Alex McKenzie. He was the signal man and radio operator. And the fellow at the instrument box down below is an Italian immigrant who had just came over from Italy 3 weeks before his getting hired to go up into to become one of the founders of the observatory, a young man, he was only in his early 20s, by the name of Sal Pagliuca. The other two founders are a guy by the name of Bob Moynihan. He was the engineer, and a name that some of you might recognize, Joe Dodge. Joe Dodge was the director and manager of the Appalachian Mountain Club hut system and the Appalachian Mountain Club from the 1920s to the 1960s. He basically died in that position. So those four became the founders. Now, I would add that in my year of research for doing this, I discovered that there was a fifth founder to the observatory, a short-haired black tabby called Tiki. Went up with the four founders. Tiki doesn't get nearly enough credit for helping found this observatory. The observatory is known for a lot of things, but they're known primarily for April 12th, 1934, when they recorded the highest land wind speed recorded by man. Highest land wind speed recorded by man at 231 mile-an-hour gust. Now I have to say it that way because in the late 1990s, off the coast of Australia, in an unmanned weather buoy, in a cyclone, a higher wind speed was recorded. I'm not going to even tell you what that wind speed is because these guys did it by hand. So this is the one that counts as far as I'm concerned. And both of those guys were up there that day to record that wind speed. There's a shot looking north from the top of the old signal house, probably about the same year. It's from the 1960s. That's the Summit House. The observatory, in conjunction with the Cog Railway, actually ran a hotel and a ballroom up at the top of Mount Washington through the 1960s. Today's observatory, built in 1979, opened in 1980. The observers there tell me that the observatory today can withstand wind speeds of 350 miles an hour. And I know plenty of meteorologists who would like nothing more than to test that theory. They have not had the opportunity to do so yet. There's the tower. Since 1932, I'm sure Will probably told you this, since 1932, a meteorologist every hour, on the hour, regardless of the weather, has stepped outside and taken a manual reading of the weather. Every hour on the hour. They haven't missed an hour. For my case, I spent a week living at the observatory in early April. Now the observatory has a volunteer program where you can get free room and board, you get free food, you get to hang out with the meteorologists, you get to hike all you want up at the top of the mountain. The catch is that you have to cook for the meteorologists, you have to cook for the observers. And as it turns out, clean and do the dishes, and so you basically have to be their cook and butler for a week. When my wife discovered that I had been accepted to the program, she was horrified. Not because she was scared for my safety, but because I am a terrible cook. I think she was more scared for the observer's safety than not. You have to take a snowcat to get up there in the wintertime. In the summertime, if you're up there, you can go up and down as you please. You drive your car up there, whatever. But in the winter, once that snowcat drops you off, you can't order Domino's if something goes sideways. You're stuck up there for a week. So they sent me up there with a veteran volunteer, a guy by the name of John Donovan, who plays a pretty big role in my book. He'd been up there, he has restaurant experience, he'd been up there. This was his 10th week that he'd spent up there. So he was my babysitter, essentially. He was to make sure that I didn't do anything wrong, I didn't poison the observers. You have to keep in mind that when I set about doing this book, I needed permission from those four, from the AMC, from the Observatory, from the Outer Road, from the Cog Railway. I needed all four of those organizations to be on board, to be able to call any one of them at any hour and get any phone number or get any photo or get any archive that I wanted. And all four of them came on board. But for the observatory's sake, that was the only one where the directors and the board of trustees, they all said yes, but then I had to live and deal with the observers at the top, or rather they had to live and deal with me. So imagine going to work, it's a pretty tight space up there. There's the kitchen. It's a pretty tight space up there, so imagine waking up every morning and going to work with a reporter living with you and asking you questions for 12 straight hours. You know, so I tried to be respectful and worked hard to you know, make food that they could eat. So when John and I went up there, one of the first things you do when you get up there is you take you do a little debrief with the downgoing volunteer team. There's an upgoing volunteer, downgoing volunteer team. And you do a little inventory, because whatever is up there, that's what you're going to be cooking with over the course of the week. So John did this little inventory, and he said, how do you want to do this? Are there some certain dishes that you would like to do? Do you want to take a day, and I'll take a day? How do you want to do it? And I said, John, how about the way that we handle this is that you tell me what to do, and I'll do it. How about that? So I became John's sous chef, basically. I did all the chopping, I did all the cutting, I stuffed the mushrooms, I stuffed the green peppers, I set the tables, and I did all the dishes. That was my job when I was up at the observatory. We stayed in these bunkhouses. There's 4 bunkhouses up at the residency. Each one holds about 6 people. So 6 times 4, plus you throw a couple of people on the couch. So you can fit about 30 people in there. You'd be on top of each other, but it would be safe. During the week that I was there was only 5 of us, so we were only working and cooking for 5 people. There's the Dobbs Lounge. There is a small room where the observers on their off time can hang out. They work long shifts. They work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and at 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. there's a nighttime crew as well that works there. So, you know, when 6 o'clock rolls around, one crew is getting off and one crew is just starting to work. You know, that the food better be ready for them. So you work hard to. Now they're all young guys and women. So fortunately, I didn't have to be fancy. You know, mac and cheese, chili, sub sandwiches, you know, casseroles, things like that. Then they would just gobble it right up. And there's John and I in the weather room. During the week that I was up there, we experienced 117 mile an hour wind gust and 87 mile an hour sustained winds. And this is a picture of John and I coming in from a morning constitutional in those 87 mile an hour winds. We were only outside for about 12 minutes. You can see the rime ice forming on our parkas from the cold, from the humidity and the cold. The story that I have to tell you, however, has to do with this guy. And all the research that I did, and all the time that I spent at the observatory, and all the details that I go into in the book, and all the presentations that I have given, the one question that I get asked the most often, by far, is, did you meet Marty? And the answer is yes, and there he is. Marty is the current observatory mascot. He's been up there since 2008. The observatory has had cats living with them, living up there since the very beginning, since 1932. In those early journals, the late 30s and the 1940s, there's 12, 14, 17 cats that are living up there at the observatory. They had a job back then, which was keeping the rodents and the animals and the mice away from the observers and the meteorologists' food, which is mostly dry goods and fruits and vegetables. Today, the cats serve an entirely different purpose, which is primarily as celebrities. Marty, for example, writes his own monthly column in the observatory newsletter. Whenever a class or a school program it takes place at the observatory, Marty is always the first, being to come out and say hello. So they do serve a purpose. But his story is a funny one. And given that it is election day, it is even more, it's a more interesting story. Marty was elected to this post in 2008. The North Conway Animal Society offered 3 kittens to the observatory for the new mascot. Marty's predecessor, Nin, had passed away a couple of months earlier. They're looking for a new one. And if you were an observatory member, you could vote for one of these 3 cats to be your next mascot. There was a big election campaign. They all carried signs, and they're all looking for your vote. And this election took place in February of 2008 on the same day as the New Hampshire presidential primary took place. It took place on the same day. Marty clobbered his opponents. I mean, it was a walk away. The election wasn't even close. But I did a little bit more digging because I wanted to see how well Marty did. And what I discovered was Marty earned more votes that day than Dennis Kucinich of the Democrats and Fred Thompson of the Republicans. So Marty did very, very well. But that's the face of a cat that has seen it all, basically. He's a little slower now, but he's a good guy. There we are at the true summit, I guess, of New England. I have some shots of the summit in the wintertime. That's what the tip-top house looks like nowadays. It's a museum now. The old Signal House, this is a reproduction. The Cog owns that now, and that's where they sell tickets out of, and they have a concession stand in there. There I am with my daughter. So this is sort of the midpoint of our slideshow, and I always throw this picture. In every presentation that I do, I always throw a picture of my daughter in the presentation. I do this for two reasons. One, because I'm a ridiculously proud dad, and she's super cute, and I love to show her off. But two, because this illustrates the accessibility of this mountain. Right? Anyone of any age, of any ability or disability, at any time of the season, with just a few bucks, can touch that summit sign. Okay? This is unusual, right, among sort of the tourist attractions of the world. If you are in the West Coast, if you're in London, if you're in Hong Kong, if you're in China, if you're in Delhi, you are going to see advertisements from the Mount Washington Chamber of Commerce or Mount Washington Valley Tourist Association trying to convince you to come to New Hampshire to visit the top of Mount Washington. And lots of people do. Between the Cog and between the road and between the shuttles and between the hikers. The state tells me that in 2017, 250,000 people touched that sign. 250,000. And that's only the registered ones. So the unregistered hikers just going up without telling anybody. So the number is probably closer to 300, 325,000, something like that. That's a lot of people. So it's a big economic generator for the Coas County. But it's a double-edged sword, of course. There is no mountain of this height anywhere in the world that has a longer casualty list than Mount Washington. No mountain even comes close. Since 1859, nearly 200 souls have perished on or around Mount Washington. That's only 100 less than Mount Everest. So the search and rescue teams are kept pretty busy in the White Mountains. Here's some snow shots. There's that Tuckerman Ravine in the background, if there's any skiers in the area. This is that's the Great Gulf in the northern presidentials. That's Mounts Jefferson, Adams, and Madison. And there's Mount Jefferson peeking up over the undercast. Again, there's a Wildcat ski area on the right there. That's the Carter Wildcat Range looking east. And there I am. All right, third leg, Mount Washington Auto Road. 7.6 miles. Has anyone driven the Mount Washington Auto Road? Yeah. If you've driven the Mount Washington Auto Road, you know that it is, there's no guardrails. There's hairpin turns. There's a 1 mile stretch of dirt road on the road. And that if you are passing someone, if there are two cars passing on the auto road, you can roll your window down and high-five the other driver coming in your direction. That's how tight things are. I love this picture, 1861. They billed themselves as the oldest man-made tourist attraction in the United States. This is a cool shot because there was a couple of years there, right where the auto road was a carriage road and an auto road. It was obviously first opened as a carriage road and then became an auto road. And there was a couple of years where both carriages and autos were going up and down that road. 1920s, little jalopy coming around a turn. That's Mount Adams in the background there. 1930s. So I'm often asked, is there anything that I did not do over the course of the year that I was researching Mount Washington? There is one thing. Every 2 years, the Mount Washington Auto Road holds a car race on the auto road. Stuntmen and race car drivers from all over the world come and give this auto road a go. It's an extremely dangerous race. And it's been going on since the 1930s. Here's a race car driver from the 1930s. Back in the 1930s, These suicide machines were getting up the mountain in 16, 15, 14 minutes. They were getting up that mountain in those cars, and that was considered insane back then. In 2017, a guy by the name of Travis Pastrani drove a souped-up Subaru Outback up that mountain in 5 minutes and 44 seconds. So, some quick math, 8 miles, 5 minutes, 44 seconds. He was going about over 60 miles. He was averaging 60 miles an hour on the auto road, including this hairpin turn. There's an actual, you can go to Google and you can Google him, and you can white knuckle it in your office the entire 5 minutes and 44 seconds. He took that hairpin turn at nearly 50 miles an hour. He drifted it on 2 wheels at nearly 50 miles an hour with a 250-foot drop at the end of that hairpin turn. It was an extraordinary race. They would not let me do that. I asked them, I wanted to be a passenger in somebody's car, you know. But they said, no, number one, I would have needed insurance. But number two, even my 185 pounds would have thrown their times off, and nobody wanted me to be a passenger. So much to my chagrin and my wife's relief, I did not take part in the auto race. But I did get to go up the shuttle. This is the snow shuttle. Even through the wintertime, the auto road, and if you want to get above tree line, the shuttle will take you to about 4,200 or so feet. Get you up above the trees. You get some beautiful views if you're not in the middle of a nor'easter like I was. But they run, January, February, March. In fact, they're running them now, and it's well worth a few bucks. The auto foot race. So here's the deal with the foot race. It is a lottery foot race. It's very difficult. One of the most difficult in the world. Ultra runners from all over the world come to run this thing. For 2 straight years in a row, a couple years ago, my wife was picked. She got to run the race. I had never been picked before. It's an average 12% incline on this race. In some places, there's 22% grade on this road. It's billed as only one hill. So in 2017, they gave me permission to run it. They simply said, yeah, you can do it. So I was in. So I had to figure out how to run it. I had to figure out how to approach this. Some of these runners have sponsors. Competitor Magazine is there. Runner's World is there. All major media is there. There's been books written just about this race. So how was I going to do this? I wasn't terribly concerned about my own. I'd get up there somehow. But what would I write about? And it took me a little while. But a few months before the race, I ran across this guy. This is George Entweiler. He's from State College, Pennsylvania, where he was born and raised. He lives down there now. He was an electrical engineer at the University of Pennsylvania, a professor. And he's been running this race since the early 80s, off and on since the early 80s. His family comes up every year. They run a bunch of cabins in northern New Hampshire to be on his team. And I went down to State College, Pennsylvania. I spent a couple of weekends with him. And then they let me be part of his team for the race in 2017. I was the water carrier. I feel like I got the short end of the stick, but I was just grateful to be on his team. There's a lot of things that make George amazing, but the main thing that makes him amazing is if you look at his bib number. His bib number is number 97. That's because George in 2017 was 97 years old. He ran that race in 4 hours and 5 minutes. I was tired when we got to the top, 4 hours and 5 minutes. He came back this year, 2018, at 98 and ran the race in 4 hours and 4 minutes. He shaved a minute off of his time. That's him at the finish line with his whole team. Basically, it's his family, his great-grandson. That's Bob in the middle. His grandson is his manager. This is Roberta, his trainer. His son, his daughter, and I guess over on the right side there, that would be his great son-in-law. So they all come up and they all wait for him at the finish line. He's an inspirational, amazing guy. And he has a real gallows sense of humor, as you might expect from someone doing the things that he does at his age. We talked, when we interviewed, George and I, we interviewed a lot. We talked hours and hours of talks we had. And he talks a lot. He is not at all afraid to talk about death. He plows right into it. And I asked him how long he was going to do this for. And he said that he planned on doing it until he was 100. And when he turned 100, he was going to drop dead at the finish line so he wouldn't have to be worried about driving back down. Now, he's changed his tune. Oops. He's changed his tune. Last month, George does a lot of fundraising. He does a lot of fundraisers for veterans organizations and soup kitchens down at State College, Pennsylvania. Last month, he became the oldest man to rappel down a 10-story building. He did it down a 13-story building in State College, Pennsylvania. This was a fundraiser. He got to the bottom, and someone told him that that there was a woman. There was an Asian woman a couple of years ago I'm trying to think of where, in Tokyo, that rappelled down a 15-story building when she was 103. She has since passed. So George has changed his tune. Now he's going to live to 104 because he wants to become the oldest human to rappel down that building. We'll see how he does. This is Mary Salvatsky. So, Mount Washington, there's a lot of crazy things that happen on Mount Washington. One of the craziest probably is Alton Weagle Day. Alton Weagle is the most famous person associated with Mount Washington that you've never heard of. He currently holds the most amount of records for climbing or doing something on Mount Washington, 27 of them. A couple of them Guinness Book of World Records. In the 1940s and 1950s, he was known as Mr. Mount Washington. He holds records such as he climbed the mountain backwards, he did it blindfolded, he did it on his hands and knees, he did it barefoot, he raced the Cog Railway to the top and won. He came back the next year and raced the Cog Railway again, beat his time. His most famous record, infamous perhaps, is pushing a wheelbarrow full of sugar all the way to the top of the mountain without setting it down. So, every year the Auto Road holds an Alton Weagle Day where people from all over the world get together and try to set crazy records in the spirit of Alton Weagle. So I took part in that particular day in 2017. I'm a poet. I love Walt Whitman. Leaves of Grass is probably one of my favorite American poems. So I set out to become the first person to read poetry out loud while climbing the mountain. But I had to become Walt Whitman. And in order to do that, I had to find a master seamstress. Her name is Mary Salvatsky. She lives in Manchester, New Hampshire. She works in a old warehouse right on Elm Street called the Varick Building. You'll have to read the book. There's a lot of connections to where she works, to Mount Washington. But if you've seen any community theater production in the last 4 decades, anywhere in New Hampshire, you've seen Mary's work. She's a costume designer. And I walked in, sight unseen. I never met her before. I walked into her place and told her what I was doing, and she immediately set to work and making me look like Walt Whitman. Making me Walt Whitman, I should say. And there I am with Walt. I have a few pounds on Walt, unfortunately, but she did a really good job. Alton Weagle Day is a crazy day. Bigfoot runners, hot dog man, the Cookie Monster and the 3 cookies, Star Wars, they all go up there. And there's Alton. Alton was born in 1911, I'm sorry. 19 years after Walt Whitman passed away. This picture is probably from the late 1920s, so he's about 20 years old in this shot. He's from Stark, New Hampshire. Has anyone been to Stark, New Hampshire? Stark, New Hampshire's up there. It's north of Jefferson. It's like one of those places where you need to purposefully go to Stark, New Hampshire, so you don't accidentally find yourself there. That's where he was born. Stark, New Hampshire is known for 2 things. The first is that in World War II, there was a German internment camp in Stark, New Hampshire, of all places. There's an amazing book written about it called Stark Decency. If the library has it, I would recommend checking that out. The other thing is the Stark Covered Bridge. It's one of the most famous, maybe the most famous bridges covered bridges in northern New England. One of the oldest. It's gorgeous, it's super long, and photographers from all over the world come to take pictures of this bridge in the fall. Well, sometimes when you're trying to figure out a guy, the character of a guy, you need only to look as far as his mom. This is Nina Weigel, Alton's mom. In 1900, she was named the Stark, New Hampshire and the surrounding areas postmistress. She also ran the train depot in Stark, New Hampshire. They were both run out of the same place. She was a single mom, raising 3 boys, including Alton. So if you put all those pieces together, right, she was a single mom, raising 3 guys in Stark, New Hampshire, and holding, besides perhaps the selectman, holding probably the most important position in that town and in the Coos County around 1900. There was no other woman who was a postmistress in New Hampshire at the time. There was no other woman who was managing a train depot at the time. She was smart and funny, and she wrote a lot. She kept a diary, and she kept it together. And she worked this job until the 1960s. She died on the job. And every morning, every day, she would look out her window because that train depot was right across the street from the Stark Covered Bridge. So that was her view every day, the Stark Covered Bridge. Then in 1954, she was already quite elderly, she was in her 60s. In 1954, a storm blew through northern New Hampshire and it blew out some of the abutments of that covered bridge. The selectmen at the time voted to tear the bridge down and replace it with a concrete overpass. Nina dragged her stove out from her home, out of the Home Depot, dragged it across the street and set up shop under the Stark Covered Bridge in protest. And she refused to move until the selectmen rescinded their vote and voted to save the bridge instead of tearing it down. It took them 3 hours. That's how important she was. So when I was looking into Alton, when I was trying to figure out why he was doing the things that he was doing, and something you have to remember about Alton is that even when he was older, after he had left Stark, after he had stopped setting Mount Washington records, he continued to set records for the rest of his life. The largest contra dance ever held in a town square was held in Keene, New Hampshire. Alton organized that. He founded the Keene Horseshoe Society. It was a professional horseshoe club. In 1963, in Guinness Book of World Records, in 1963, the longest professional play horseshoe match in the world happened at the Keene Horseshoe Society, and Alton was there managing that game. Alton currently holds the record for the most amount of pies baked at the top of Mount Monadnock in one day. He carried the stove up himself. And when he passed away, quite an elderly man, on the day of his passing, he held the New Hampshire Red Cross record for most amount of blood donated. So, sometimes when you're looking for stubbornness, obsession, ingenuity, brains, authority, all you have to do is look toward someone's mom or dad. And in my case, it was someone's mom. Alton's mom should have a biography written about her in and of herself. She was that amazing of a human being. And there's Alton as a young boy, about 40 years or so before his mom would save that bridge. He was also the part of the first couple to be married on the Cog Railway. That's 1955. It's his wife, his bride-to-be, Cora. Here's my run. This is my class of 2017. There I am in the middle. A lady pushed a stuffed rabbit in a wheelchair up the road. I think that was the most in the spirit of Alton Weigel. Buddy the Elf ran. There's Leo running for cancer awareness. And there's Nate. Nate's from Denver, Colorado. Sight unseen, he wrote a little article about Alton Weigel Day. He threw his unicycle in the back of his trunk. He drove to New Hampshire. Showed up on the morning of Alton Weigel Day, only to discover that record had already been set. Someone had already done unicycle. So, undaunted, he drove into town, bought himself 3 tennis balls, and decided he was going to juggle while riding a unicycle up the mountain. He got about a quarter of a mile of the way up before he gave up. It was just too steep for him. But that's the kind of spirit that's important. There I am reading to the mountain. It is a lot harder to read out loud and walk at the same time than I expected it to be. But it was a beautiful day. This happens in May. The mountain was very gentle that day. It looks like the Scottish moors. And there I am at the top. I got 1.5 times through Leaves of Grass, the 1855 version, which is a little shorter than the rest. Now I'm going to close with a story about the hikers, about the AMC and the hikers. The Mount Washington Observatory holds an annual fundraiser called Seek the Peak, where hikers from all over the world come together. You can register and you raise money for the observatory. Some of them hike in teams. You can hike solo. The auto road is open. The Cog is open. The shuttles are going. So it is mayhem at the summit. Thousands and thousands of people over the course of that day are up there at the summit in the concessionary. So I planted myself up there. I wanted to write something about the hikers. I wasn't sure exactly what, but I wanted to meet some of them. So I just began to introduce myself as they started showing up. This is Jason. He's a member of the Kilted Hikers, hikers of Scottish descent. They hike in kilts. Jason was the first person there that morning. He started up the mountain at 3 in the morning. On the left there, that's her name is Almuth Curly Penzel. Almuth Curly Penzel. She's a German immigrant. She came over in 1860 with her husband, who she met in the Peace Corps, of all places. And she is a major hiker. She came up all dressed in Hawaiian garb. It's hard to tell, but her hair is bright red. So I went up and I introduced myself and I said, "Hi, I'm Dan. I'm writing a book on Mount Washington. I'd love to talk with you about hiking." This is the first words out of her mouth. She didn't know me from Adam. The first words out of her mouth was, "I'd love to speak with you, but I'm really hungry right now and I need to get a slice of pizza." "But if you give me your card, my husband and I own a little cabin in Porter, Maine. It's right next to Crystal Lake. You bring your whole family up, you go swimming, and then we'll barbecue and we'll talk about hiking." First words out of her mouth. So I gave her my card. And the next morning, she sent me an email. The very next morning, "When are you coming up?" So that's how I spent, that's how we spent the afternoon up in Porter, Maine, hiking with Curly Penzel up at her cabin. She's pretty amazing. She's 77 now. Kids of all ages come up. This is Leah. She came up on her dad's back. And this is Mark and Amy. And I'm going to finish with my story about Mark and Amy because it's a nice upbeat way to slide us into the election results. Just remember their story in about a half hour. As soon as Amy showed up wearing a big white fuzzy tutu, I knew something was up because, I'm a reporter, so I'm good with observing things like that. And it turns out Mark and Amy were getting married at that day. They hiked up together. That's their very chilly justice of the peace in between there. Their story is an interesting one. The rest of their party came up on the Cog Railway. They let me crash their wedding and attend their wedding. And then I spent some time with them afterwards. They were both born in Northampton, Massachusetts. Amy is a couple of years younger than Mark. They went through the same school system together, the same public school system together, but they never knew each other. They attended and attend the same church together. There's dozens of photos of the two of them in the same photo, in church, doing church activities and at church events, but they'd never met each other. Mark worked at a video shop, and Amy had a crush on him, but she was too shy to introduce herself. A couple of years ago, the two of them, within 24 hours of each other, signed up to an online dating site. The very first hit that each of them got back was each other. And they lived 2 blocks away from each other. So talk about meaning to be together, right? So you never know who you'll find up at the top of Mount Washington. So shield your eyes, I'm going to turn the lights on. And I'm happy we have some time to chat. I'm happy to chat about Mount Washington or anything else that you might have. This is a tiny fraction of the year that I spent up there. So the book gets into skiing and into Tuckerman Ravine, into hiking trails. I actually spent a weekend with a bunch of landscape artists learning, trying to paint, move to a different medium and painting Mount Washington just because I wanted to experience that. I spent several weekends weeding dandelions at the top of Mount Washington. The state has a program. Dandelions are an invasive species to the White Mountains, who knew? And they're choking out some of those wildflowers, so every year the state grabs a bunch of volunteers. You're all welcome to volunteer. They're always looking for people. They'll drive you up there, and you spend a few hours at the summit weeding dandelions, which is pretty good views for weeding. So I did a lot of those things. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do you feel that New Hampshire is home? I'm asking because my husband also is from Buffalo.
Oh!
And when he got to New Hampshire as a kid, camp first, New Hampshire was home.
Yeah. Where in Buffalo are you from? The city or the town, or where did you grow up?
City.
Where were you born? Right in the city?
Yeah.
I was born in Cheektowaga.
Oh.
Are you familiar with Cheektowaga? It's a suburb right outside. And then I lived in Buffalo. I went to University of Buffalo and Buffalo State. That's where I got my degrees. Yes. In fact, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of my coming to New Hampshire story. I came in 1999 to cover. I was working for the Associated Press out of New Jersey at the time, and they sent me up to New Hampshire to cover the Al Gore, George W. Bush presidential primary. I was a political reporter in New Jersey. So I came up to New Hampshire to cover that. And I was the low man on the totem pole at the time, so I didn't get to cover George Bush or Al Gore. I got to cover Gary Bauer. Remember Gary Bauer?
Yes.
So I followed Gary Bauer around. And my claim to fame, what happened in Manchester, New Hampshire, every 4 years they hold this ridiculous thing, the biscuit pancake flip. All the presidential primary candidates have to actually go and flip pancakes. I don't know if you all knew this. And so back in New Jersey, I was a policy wonk, right? I covered the RSAs and legislation and all that type of stuff. And then I got to the main stage, I got to national politics, and I was covering Gary Bauer flipping pancakes at the Manchester Armory. It was quite disillusioning. So when they asked me to continue on to South Carolina, I said no. And the reason that I said no is because I had fallen in love with New Hampshire and I wanted to stay here. And part of the reason why I fell in love with New Hampshire had to do with a guy by the name of Jim Gagney. Jim Gagney is New Hampshire's first native-born Mount Everest summiter. And when I was working in southern New Hampshire, I was living in Derry at the time, and I was looking for stories to do, and I came across Jim, who was heading off to Mount McKinley in Alaska to climb Mount McKinley. Now it's called Denali Mountain, but it was Mount McKinley back then. And it was a great story, and I called him up, and he said, well, one of the questions that I asked him is, how are you training to climb Mount McKinley? And he said, oh, I'm training on Mount Washington. And I thought, how absurd. Mount McKinley is 20,000-foot mountain, and you're training on a 6,000-foot mountain? That made no sense at all to me. So when Jim came back from that climb, he called me, and he said, and I didn't know anyone, I was still looking to make friends, I'd only been here for a couple of months. He called me and he said, hey, how would you like to go for a hike in the White Mountains? I'll show you around. And I said, yeah, great, because I was, sure, it's a couple thousand feet, that's not a big deal. I hike up and down the Jersey Shore all the time, right? So he said, how would you like to go, you want to go climb, have you ever heard of the Old Man on the Mountain? And I said, who is that? I had no idea. So my very first hike in the White Mountains was up the caretaker's route of Cannon Mountain, of the Old Man on the Mountain. A hand overhead ladder and rope route to get up the mountain. And I puked. Halfway up, I felt so sick. I was like the Sylvester Marsh, right? I was not prepared. I had no idea it would be this hard. I thought for sure he was trying to kill me. So we got up to the top of the Old Man on the Mountain. This was before he fell in 2003. And there I stood on the forehead of the Old Man on the Mountain, looking down Franconia Notch. And from the moment that I stood up on his forehead and I looked down the notch, I knew that that's what I was going to be doing for the rest of my life. I knew it. As empty as my stomach was, and as terrible as I felt, and the fact that I could barely walk for the next week, I still knew it. I knew it immediately. It's hard to explain.
So do you have a favorite memory from the year? I know you have millions, but.
Yeah. From my year on
Yeah.
Washington. Actually, my favorite memory, other than taking my daughter up there, which was amazing, my favorite memory has nothing to do with Mount Washington, weirdly enough. So there are 2 towns in the entire country named Mount Washington. There's a lot of Washingtons, but there's only 2 Mount Washingtons. One of them is in Kentucky, and the other one is in Massachusetts. And the one in Massachusetts bills itself as the town among the clouds. That's how they bill themselves. Among the Clouds is the name of the newspaper that used to be published at the top of Mount Washington back at the turn of the century. So I wanted to know why. I wanted to figure this place out. It's Mount Washington, Massachusetts sits in the far southwestern corner of the state. It's the second smallest town in Massachusetts. There's like 217 people or something like that live there. But it's the site of the state's highest waterfall, Bashfish Falls. So there's a lot of woods and things out there. So I called them. I called the town clerk. And the town clerk, in a town like that, the town clerk is also the secretary, and she's the librarian. And I talked with her, and I said, I'm doing this thing, and I was just curious why, it's called that. And she said, well, why don't you just come down here and find out? And I said, okay. So they put me up. They invited me down. A third of the town, they have one little, like a meeting house. And the meeting house is also, that's where all the elections take place. That's where the town offices are. One whole wall is the library. About a third of the town came out to meet me. And I sat in a room, maybe this big, with a third of the town in it. And we talked about the town and its connections to Mount Washington. And there's a lot of them. The constable came out. They actually have a constable, an elected constable. That's what he's called, is the constable. Who got that job, and his father before him was a constable, and his grandfather was the constable. It's this crazy anachronistic throwback to the 19th century. And Mother Lee from the Shakers, the founder of the Shakers, lived there for several years. One of the very first bare-knuckle boxing matches, professional boxing matches that ever took place in Mount Washington. And the biggest claim to fame of Mount Washington is it was a vacation spot, and nobody knew this. It was a secret vacation spot of Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth would drive his Cadillac up from New York, up to Mount Washington, Massachusetts, because he owned a hunting cabin there, and he would hunt with the locals, and he would give all the little kids a ride in his Cadillac. I mean, there's like 3 streets in Mount Washington. So I spent a couple of days down there, and I have to say, it was extraordinary. It was like going back in time, So that was my fondest memory, and I wrote a whole chapter about it. Even though, it's, we're 200 miles from the actual mountain, but the connections are pretty amazing, and the people were pretty amazing, and just learning to sink yourself into this little community. It was pretty cool. I gotta say, it's very memorable. And they've invited me back to do a presentation there. So I told them the whole town has to come.
I think we're okay.
One more.
To what do you attribute your curiosity about life?
My mom. My mom.
Hey, moms.
Yeah. My mother, and my dad too, but my mom had me, and my dad had me, this is back in the mid-1960s. They were both 40 when they had me, in 1966. So that's pretty old for 1966. And the reason that they took that long is because they were travelers. My mom traveled all over England. I have pictures on her on the SS Volcana, which was a steamship that she went on, complete with the trunks and everything, where she traveled all through the Aegean Sea and up to New England. And when I was old enough to do it, the very first trip that I took was to London. And the reason I wanted to go to London is because my mother My mom passed when I was very young. She died of cancer when I was 17. But my father gave me all of her diaries. She kept these really detailed, crazy detailed diaries, like this is what the weather was like, and this, there was, the street was well paved, and and this is what we had for lunch, that type of stuff. And she kept a really, really detailed diary of her trip in London. So the first thing that I did, my first overseas trip was taking that diary and going everywhere she went. And I would just go in the order that she did it. And we spent, a week and a half basically following her footsteps. So I got it from them.
That's the best story of the night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to hang around for as long as Susan will have us.
5 minutes. Closing in 10 minutes. I also want to remind you that next Tuesday we have another wonderful program about women in the military, and we have a living historian coming who will be dressed in a military, what do they call it, uniform. And we also have a tribute to the service people from Northampton that, what's his name?
No,
Dave
O'Brien
O'Brien put together, and we'll be showing that as well as a great tribute for Veterans Day. So I hope you'll spread the word and come out next Tuesday as well.
And can I mention, do you mind if I mention what my next project is?
Oh,
Do you mind?
okay.
So this is Nancy Sander. Nancy and I have met for the first time today, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for her to be here, because my next project is a biography of her father. And her father was an amazing doctor from Manchester and Camden, New Hampshire in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. I won't go into too much about his life. We have a lot to learn, but we have to buy the book. This is the first. Nancy lives in Salem, in Massachusetts, and this is the first time that we had met. And her and I are going to be seeing a lot of each other over the course of the next year, because it's an extraordinary story, unlike any that I've ever seen. I've interviewed dozens of people over the course of the last couple of weeks, and each and every one of them have told me a story about how her father saved someone's life in their family, or made them a better person, or went out of his way to do some, showed up in the middle of the night with his little black doctor bag to help somebody with a burst appendix or something like that. It's an incredible story. So that's my next project, and I'm really, really grateful.
You can all come back next when you're back.
Yeah, we can get back together. We'll do a program together. Okay. She's like, oh no. She's like, what have I got myself into? It's a story worth telling.
Yes, it is.
So there are some books available, right?
Yes,
Coming back
of course.
For purchase, so.
Thank you all.
It's great.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go back there.
I found your book in the new